Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. In this podcast series, we will talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. We ask them to reflect on old and new problems, challenges, and possibilities confronting Nepal. The theme for Nepal Conversations' first season is disasters. We will present a series of conversations on the topic of disasters and what it means for Nepali society. This series is supported by Levium Trust.
In today's episode of Nepal Conversation, we'll be talking to Shobhit Shakya, who is a PhD candidate and junior research fellow in Ragnar Nurk's Department of Innovation and Governance at Tallinn University of Technology, Estonia. His ongoing PhD in public administration concerns the role of Guti Institution of Nepal as a form of non-Western public administration. Mr. Sakya's other areas of research include governance, public administration, information communication technology for development, cultural heritage, and engaged Buddhism. He is the managing editor of the journal, the Estonian Journal of Administrative Culture and Digital Governance. He has also been involved in the institutional research funding project entitled Challenges to State Modernization in 21st Century Europe, Theoretical Developments and Future Scenarios. Hello, Soviji. So welcome to Nepal Conversation. We are really glad to have you as our guest today. So before we go to more substantive question, I know your current research focuses on heritage preservation and reconstruction following a disaster. Could you tell us your personal journey of becoming a disaster researcher? Because I know in your previous academic background, you've done mostly focused on like governance and e-governance, but how did you become a disaster researcher? Could you tell us a little bit about your experiences?
Thank you so much, Nimasi, for the question and the invite to participate in this platform. And disaster researcher, that sounds a bit interesting, right? I know there is a very large community of scholars who are doing researches regarding disasters, and I happen to be one of them as well. Not by intention, but because somehow it linked up well, and I am studying the case study of the post-earthquake heritage restoration in Nepal. But to be more precise, what I'm studying is the traditional institution of governance in Nepal, namely the Guti institution. And I am looking at this from the framework of non-Western public administration. So my PhD, which is ongoing, is about non-Western public administration. The framework is based on the work of my supervisor, Professor Wolfgang Dressler. And in public administration literature, it is very much Western or Anglo-American dominated. And as of late, except for the global Western standard of public administration, there are other paradigms that have been developing in public administration. So it is our interest to see these different kind of elements and institutions that seem to have some kind of relevance in a particular context. So that is how my research starts, and I am looking at Guti Institution of Nepal from the perspective of it being a Buddhist institution of governance. And it started in 2015, not just because of the earthquake, but also because I decided that I will start a master's program here in Estonia, which was e-governance technologies and services. So I was initially from an IT and engineering background, and that is in 2015 exactly when I started to get interested and started to study governance and public administration and state capacity, state-society relationship and all that. So the timing was just right that while I was learning about all of these things, I was also seeing how the disaster preparedness or the failure of preparedness and how the government was handling and the role of the government and all that was rolling out in Nepal. So this became really a topic of really close interest for me. And incidentally, as soon as I completed a master's, there was a PhD position that was open, and my supervisor was doing these wonderful researches in non-Western public administration, dealing with Islamic PA and Confucian PA. And I was, being a Newa myself, I was very much into things happening in Nepal, not just from the earthquake perspective, but also from the heritage perspective as well. Uh, right in 2015, there was this festival called Samyak Mahadan, and this was being held after, I think, 90 years. I don't clearly remember now. And I was following that very closely and seeing how there was a land which was now the property of the Nepal Army, or at least the Nepal Army Sports Center is located in that. It used to belong to the Guti, which organized the Samyak Mahadan, and it was fortunate that they were able to organize it. And it was basically organized by the Guti itself. And before that as well, there were like multiple occasions when I was very fascinated about how Gucci institution was able to mobilize the community, the citizen mobilization. So yeah, that is how the whole research began, and then I
Very interesting.
studied disaster and the disaster response for my research.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really fascinating research journey as well. And you mentioned about this local importance of local practices and ideas. And I was just wondering, how challenging has it been for you to incorporate these non-Western ideas and paradigms within your academic work and to gain a kind of academic legitimacy that is required? How challenging has it been for you to do this?
Well, there is always a challenge, but fortunately, the Newa culture and especially Guti as well, right? It is very much well researched within the community of anthropologists who study Nepal and Newa community. This is very well researched topic. So it was in my part to kind of take all of that and translate that into public administration literature and make it relatable for that particular audience. And also, it was already set up for me to take advantages of. There was already a lot of researches going on in the field of non-Western public administration, and my supervisor and several other authors as well were contributing to that particular field. It wasn't really a difficult task for me to legitimize my research, which is from a non-Western perspective. Within public administration, this is already set up that the standard global Western practices is actually just Anglo-American. And if you want to even study, let's say, parts of Europe, you have to go out of that particular sphere of Anglo-American dominated global standard practice. So in that sense, it wasn't, I would say it wasn't that very difficult. So it was rather a matter of chance that I met my supervisor and my interests matched and all that. So yeah.
Yeah. I just want to follow up on your uh, point that you made on your disciplinary perspective. You approach disaster from public administration perspective. How do you define disaster from your disciplinary standpoint, and what can we learn from disasters?
In public administration, it is increasingly more common that you approach your research from a interdisciplinary perspective. And I totally agree with this as well, especially when it comes to disasters, because disasters are such cataclysmic events which have its effect, which resonates in multiple domains, right? It's very much important to have a well-rounded set of tools to really look at how disasters affect the society as a whole. It has been the trend that public administration is approached increasingly more from an interdisciplinary approach. And in my own research, I have used concepts such as critical juncture framework or disaster as an accelerant. So this is certainly not just in public administration, right? This is, I think, cross disciplines used concepts and frameworks. If you look at public administration literature, there somehow is a theme, however. Most of the themes would be about preparedness, policy, government capacity, and resilience of the mechanism in place. And I think the response to disasters is certainly a public administration question, right? Crisis reveals how robust the system in place are. So it is a litmus test for the institutional arrangement. And it is even said that there is no such thing as natural disasters. Rather, disasters happen when events are not managed properly. So in that sense, disasters are very well within the domain of public administration. Mm-hmm. And but disasters aren't totally anticipated or something like that. I mean, totally prepared for as well. But at least I think there can be some kind of reflection of how or why policy failures occurred and why disasters happen. In most cases, it is a human error rather than just blaming it on the natural phenomenon. In public administration, we have a saying that new public management is a recipe for disaster. So, yeah, we see it in that particular approach that it is a usual phenomena that disasters does come. It is the question of how capable the state is to handle that and respond to that. It is also the question of adaptability and how quickly governments can adapt. So clearly, 2015 earthquake in Nepal has shown some of the aspect of resilience of the community and the government as a whole, right? The society has a role in the state as well, and there is some aspect of stateness in the society as well. So it was clearly seen what was the strength and weaknesses in Nepal by the earthquake that happened in 2015. And now the global pandemic that is going on is showing the same thing about other governments as well. So for public administration, this is really important research of how governments are able to or not are able to handle any disaster scenarios. And I think the researches that have come up and papers that have been published within public administration discipline from various scholars and the volume of that since the pandemic began, that clearly shows that public administration scholars are very much interested in disaster studies.
Thanks so much, Shobhit. It's really fascinating, and particularly as someone who's come from a public administration background, I wanted to ask a little bit about your published research, and particularly focused on 2015 Nepal earthquake. Much of your published research has looked at community-led response, what you are terming as sort of traditional organizations and how they respond to disaster. And I think that can also be linked to how they interact with public officials, right? I mean, at the bureaucracy, for example. Could you tell us a little bit about the role of these traditional organizations? What did you find in your research, their potential, the kind of challenges that they face, particularly in the context like Nepal, where, as you said, the public administrations are not well capacitated, or they had different motivation to kind of ignore or discard some of these more community-led informal kind of responses. So what kind of what does your research say about the role of these traditional organizations, their potential and the challenges?
How I approached this was mainly like rather than approaching from the disaster angle and then going towards that, what I did was I went from the other way around. And initially, I wasn't really looking at it from a disaster perspective exactly, right? And when I looked at the booties and how they function, I was slightly starting to realize that actually these are very useful in any cases of disaster scenarios, right? And this was even before I was in Estonia doing my master's in e-governance. So uh, how my interest towards that increased was seeing how these multiple festivals and the heritage as well that was previously and to extent later on as well was managed by these traditional organizations. And when the earthquake happened, what I saw was the volunteers and people from community organizations such as Gutis, Khalas, Puchas, Tol Sudar Samitis. There are several of different types or different names of community organizations that are very prevalent amongst the community in my hometown, Patan, and Kathmandu in general. Uh, so my reflection was that they were very much instrumental in the early responses as well, and also in the long-term rehabilitation. And when I started doing the case study, then I started to look at more literature regarding disaster studies. And I think community mobilization is something that is seen as an obligatory part of any disaster response, right? And um, without having the community volunteers and mass mobilization, I don't think it is even possible to overcome disasters of grand scale, large scale. So it was a very fascinating discovery for me that what I was already interested in was also linking up with uh, the phenomenon that was being rolled out in Nepal. And but of course, there are challenges of how these organizations are not really fit into the governance overall framework of Nepal. This is, of course, because in Nepal, we have been very much into looking outwards, right? We do not really focus on strengthening what we already have, but rather we want to look outwards and we want to uh, copy uh, Western institutions and implement that. And this has always been so, right? If you look at the Rana regime itself as well and what they prioritize, it was already there that they usually looked south, which was British India during that time. So and this has continued, and the developmentalism in Nepal really ignores the native strengths, right? The vernacular aspect of what there already is in regards to traditional practices. So, in that sense, there is already a trajectory that is going forward. So, to really change that, it is the most difficult part. In the aftermath of the earthquake as well, most of the traditional Bhuti organization, they had to register as user committees, right? Some kind of NGO to really have legitimate access to funds that was being granted out by the municipalities or the National Reconstruction Authority. So that was really sad to see, and it is also difficult to really say that this is the traditional organizations that are doing the work on the field, right? Because if you look at it, it is rather user committees and new organizations that are doing the work. But if you dig a bit more, then you find out that actually these, in many cases, these have been established out of the old organizations or the members of the old organization. Yeah, so there is this challenge to really unearth the phenomena and to link that with how traditional institutions have the potential. But it's not something that is very much unclear. So I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's really, really interesting. I mean, I think it's really, as you said, unfortunate how this is they have to go through this formalization process despite
Yeah.
having that really long history of um, community engagement and community mobilization. Uma, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, just following up on that, your research clearly shows that there are many examples of these well embedded traditional response systems. You
Mhm.
mentioned about Guti and Tulsi Siddha Samitis, which are obviously very, very well positioned to prepare against disaster risk and then also respond to it. But
Mhm.
why do you think are they often neglected within these formal and governmental systems of preparedness and reconstruction? Why is that the case? And what can be done to strengthen this? Did you find any kind of best practices or good ways in which they have been substantively utilized in preparing these kind of overall governmental formal systems of preparedness and reconstruction? Are there any examples that you can share where this has been seen to be done more successfully?
There are a lot of examples, of course, but for that, I will go to your first part of the question, which you asked that why this is happening, that they are not
Yeah.
being put into the mainstream framework of governance. Um, I did get your question correctly, right? The first part
Yes.
was about why
Yes.
this is not happening, and I think I addressed that a bit to while answering Nimesti's question before this. But it is quite common in Nepal. It has always been very common that Nepal has a tendency to look outwards for solution,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, and when there is a trajectory and path to dependency, it's really difficult to move away from that. And if there are acts and policy changes that have been implemented, there is already a trajectory to that, and it is very difficult to unhinge that. And in our case, we were always looking at more to the south, even from the Mullah period itself. Then during the Saharism as well, uh, there were templates that were followed from the different systems that were prevalent in India as well. And I mean, like the name panchayat itself kind of hints to that, isn't it? So, and if you see the panchayat policy towards how they approach the policy changes and reforms that they introduce, especially concerning the Guti Samsan Act of 1964 and the subsequent amendments to that act, they didn't really look at capitalizing on the strengths of what Gutis actually were, but rather they looked at it from tackling the problems that were there with the Guti institution, right? So it has always been the case that Nepal sees the traditional as something that needs reforms, and there is this modernist attitude to how the policy have been implemented, and that is exactly why the 2019 Guti bill protest happened. Right? It was always the the problems with the institutions that were the focus. The tenant farmers were being exploited is what always was highlighted. But that is not the only thing about Gucci. And moreover, like if you look at the Gucci's of Kathmandu Valley, there isn't that much of a problem of the 10 farmers being exploited as well, in comparison to Gucci's that are outside Kathmandu Valley, and is rather later invention than a very Newa institution. So this really affects why these traditional institutions are not taken into account when formulating the overall apparatus that is kept in place. Guti Samsung is really not a good example here, but still, Guti Samsung did try to get or claim some roles in the post-earthquake heritage restoration projects as well, but the government didn't really allow that. And I would say, like, Guti Samsung itself is as a agency is not that very strong. And if the government did provide any role to do research, then I wouldn't think any of the projects would have been that very much of a success either. But there is this clear attitude of the government to see anything traditional as being not that very useful for implementation. What is difference between a user community that is registered with the municipalities compared to a Gucci of the past, right? It is a community organization, and there isn't much difference if Gucci's want to rebuild some of the structures they actually were utilizing and they were actually overseeing in the past as well. But the legal requirements are always hurdles because the law does not recognize these traditional institutions. So I think there is a huge flaw in how the policy has developed and the trajectory that is already in place. And it'll take a lot of collective effort from the communities and the governments, local mainly, and maybe the federal government as well, to really change this and see the potentials of these traditional institutions.
Yeah.
And yeah, please.
I thought this was fascinating, like, because it's not really the way state sees these traditional organization and in a very utilitarian kind of objective. Only, if it is useful only if it fits the definition of utility for the state, right? I mean, it doesn't really see other forms of kind of instrumental value or other kind of even intrinsic value of this traditional organization. It will only see as kind of useful if it fits the definition of the state, and what it sees as a utility. But I wanted to kind of switch gear a little bit, so because from Guti, I think it's related to that, but because your research also focuses on sort of governance of public spaces, right? More generally, sort of how not just in the context of post-disaster, but also more generally. You use the word developmentalism, which is very interesting. And so that includes governing of public spaces, also includes heritage sites. And very often in Nepal, we've seen that, reconstruction or renovation of heritage sites or public spaces is a subject of intense controversy. We've seen that in the reconstruction of Rani Pokhari, very infamous kind of conflict between community and the government. More recently, in the renovation of Kamal Pokhari, right? There are different examples. I'm sure there are examples from Patan also. So does that say something about some systemic or structural problems, governance related problems in the way the municipality or the local government is managing these public spaces? Are there is it similar to the kind of problems that you were saying about, like the outward looking and that kind of thing that you mentioned earlier? So what do you think is wrong with the particularly the local government's approach to governing public spaces, and how, I mean, can you also provide some clues about how it can be these problems can be addressed, or how we can do better in manage and in governing public spaces, but particularly heritage sites?
Mhm. What I have realized is that the old areas tend to have more public spaces than the new residential areas, right? I'm not saying about the planned residential areas. We have few of those in Kathmandu Valley, but if you look at areas which were not really planned, but there are houses, and if you compare that to the old town areas, the previously walled cities, you see that there is especially more public spaces there. If you see these structures such as Pati or Palcha, and if you see these Hiti or Dungeda, these are public spaces, right? But if you go to a new settlement area, you will not see a public water tap anywhere, right? So this is very much about how the approach to the planning the government has, and we are in a transition, right? Kathmandu and Nepal as a whole, it has been in a perpetual transition, and when there is unsettled power dynamics, there will always be conflict. And regarding the open spaces, the conflicts that have occurred recently, this is very much because the ownership is not clear, right? Previously, I see these open spaces, open public spaces, as being under the ownership of the community. It used to be some kind of chok or courtyard, or there used to be these hiti or water resources, ponds, and there used to be gutis who had one or two ritualistic duties to the ponds, and also the public utility duties to the resources, right? They used to clean. There is a specific festival, Siti Noha, where most of these gutis which are concerned about water resources are supposed to clean and also perform rituals, but mainly about cleaning and maintenance as well. So it was community ownership, right? It was the responsibility of the people, the community, to look after that and also benefit from the resources. If you go to Patna even now, you will see a lot of these open resting platform where anyone can go and sit, and if it is rainy, can take shelter, right? And usually it is always the community that looks after them as well. So it is how it was in overall design, and this was the same with Brani Pokhari or Kamal Pokhari as well, the conflicts that you mentioned. And because of the policy changes and the enactment of new legal acts, the Gucci institution, it kind of degrades, or it is sidelined, and there isn't a clear claim of ownership from the community anymore, because the Guccis have gone defunct, right? So once that happens, who fills the void? Now, there is, from my understanding, there isn't a clear patron to this, right? In Kathmandu itself, right now, if you might have heard, there is this issue going on about the shops that are in the Darbar Square area, and there is a conflict of ownership. Nobody knows who is supposed to handle that, right?
Right.
There is the Hanmandoka Museum, which is also involved. There is KMC, which is involved, and the Department of Archaeology, which is involved. So the same thing with Rani Pokhri as well. There was a tussle for ownership of the Rani Pokhri project. Same thing with Kastamandap as well. there was a tussle for the ownership, right? And that the whole conflict that is happening is because we are in a transition, and the transition is because rather than building upon the existing frameworks that we have, we rather wanted to start as if it was a clean slate, which it never is. So that is the problem with all the conflicts that you see with open spaces. I look at this from the lens of polycentricism and commons orientedness, that these open spaces are commons pool resources in a way. And I think it needs to be continued in that way as well, because that is basically how it functions, right? If you have if you have a pond, which is basically for regenerating the groundwater, um, it is for the benefit of the community itself, and the ownership also should be with the community. Of course, there can be a co-production between a collaborative approach between the local government and the community as well. And this has happened whenever there has been a clear ownership claim from the community. The Kathmandu Metropolitan City Office has provided funds, and it has worked out perfectly without any conflict. In my research, I've given examples of Maitipur Mahabir, and more well-known example would be Kastamandap, where the community that was formed, of course, there was initially conflict, but later on, when the community was formed and it was taken as being legitimate and accepted by the wider community as well, then everything went perfectly, and now it is at the verge of completion as well. So I think this is the whole problem is because of the transition that there has been going on in perpetuity when it comes to governance frameworks in place and how systems are changing, and there isn't a clear vision towards that. That I think is a problem.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that insight with us. We are actually now coming to the end of our conversation, but before we go, I was wondering, could you say something about the future of heritage conservation and reconstruction research in Nepal? What kind of prospects do you see on this front, and especially from the perspective of disasters?
There has been a lot going on, and I think I would say, this is the best time to be doing disaster studies or heritage studies in Nepal. Since the 2015 earthquake, you can clearly see that the content on the World Wide Web regarding heritage of Nepal has increased like many folds, maybe 10 or 20 folds than before. So there is a lot of things to look at, and there is a lot of ways in which researches can be approached. So this is generally a very exciting time for scholars who are interested in studying the effects of disasters in the long term in a society. And awareness of heritage amongst youngsters has been at its all-time high, and this will certainly have ripple effects in multiple sectors like tourism, politics, urban planning, and perhaps education as well. So there is just very much a lot of opportunity for researchers who want to study heritage and disaster and its effect to the society. So that is what I think I want to emphasize, that this needs to be done because it is very important for documenting and it is also very important for learning from it, so that it can be useful uh, for other places as well, and it can somehow provide a blueprint of how things can be handled, or how things can be looked at.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks.
that's really
Yeah,
really
and thanks
useful.
for ending in that very positive note. I'm sure there's a lot of prospect, and good luck with your future research in this area also.
Thank you so much, Nimesi, and thank you so much, Umazi, for this wonderful opportunity and wonderful questions as well.
Thank you.